So to call educational detail component within the registration component, we need to understand few things. First thing, how to call one component within another. Okay, so suppose you have two component, one component 1, and this component 1 is in the C name space. You have one more component, component 2, and this component 2 is also within C namespace. So in component 1's markup, that is component's component, if you want to call component 2 anywhere, you can do that using namespace colon component name, that is component 2. Okay, and then close this. So if in component 1 I want to call component 2, what can I do? I can simply use this tag C is the namespace colon component 2. That's it. So the namespace colon and the name of the component. Using this tag, you will be able to call component 2 within component 1. So I have answer to this question, how to call one component within another. Okay. Second question, how to pass value from parent component to child component and vice versa. This is the second question. Now, what value I am talking about? This value is some data. This value is nothing but some data. Okay, and I want this data to have two-way binding between parent component and child component. I repeat, there is some data. I want this data to have dynamic binding between parent component and child component. So if component 1 is the parent component, and component 2 is the child component, and how we define which one is parent, which one is child? So if in the component 1 markup, if in component 1's markup I am calling component 2, then component 1 becomes parent, and since I'm calling component 2 within component 1, it becomes child. Okay, so in parent component and child component, I want to have some data binding, two-way data binding. That means if suppose in parent component, if I am using this data, and in child component also I am using this data. Okay, I am using data in parent component, also in child component. If there is any change in data, within this child component, that should be reflected in the parent component as well. That is called two-way data binding. I repeat, if there is any change in data, Okay, either at parent component or at child component, it should be reflected in both. How to achieve this? How to achieve this? That is simple. That is very simple in Lightning. That is very simple in Lightning. So, a valid question is how? See, this is component 1 markup. This is component 1 markup. And within this component 1 markup, suppose you have defined an aura attribute which holds your data. And the name of this aura attribute be data1 and has some type, say string. Okay. You have this component 2. You want in component 2 you have one attribute with the name data1 child, okay, of type string. Good. Component 1, I have an attribute with the name data1. Component 2, I have one more attribute with the name data1 child. Now what I want is, I want this data1 and I want this data1 child to have dynamic binding. That is if there is any change in data1 child, that should be reflected in data1 also. And if there is any change in data1, that should be reflected in data1 child also. So what I will do, since this one is the parent, component 1 is the parent, it must be calling component 2. Correct? Along with that, I'll add one attribute which will be like data1 child attribute defined in this component 2 is binded with the value of data1 in the parent component. That's it. We are done. Simple. Very simple. You have two attributes, data1 at the parent level, data1 child at the child level, and you want to have a two-way binding. You want data1 child to reflect exactly what data is there in data1, and in data1 you want exactly what data is there in data1 child. So what you do, you bind them. So how you do that? When you define the child component, that time the attribute of the child can be binded with the attribute defined at the parent level using the attribute name at the child level equals to this expression v dot the attribute name at the parent level. That is cool, right? Now Let's take one more example. Suppose this time you have an aura attribute with the name CList defined in the parent, and this aura attribute is of type list. Okay. Similarly, you have one aura attribute of name. Let me make this one as plist and this one as CList, of type list defined at the child level. Now you want that plist and CList should have data binding, two-way data binding. So if I increase the size of this plist in the parent, it should be reflected in CList, and if I increase the size of this CList in component 2 in child, then it should be reflected in plist as well. If I decrease the size, it should be reflected in plist as well. So whatever changes I make at the component 2 level, should get reflected in component 1, and whatever change I make in component 1 should get reflected in component 2. How to achieve that? Simple. Bind both of them. plist is equals to dot CList. CList equals to v dot plist. Done. When you define this component 2, first do the data binding for this data 1 child if you want to, and then do the data binding for CList, and then close this component 2 tag. You are done. Okay. So similar example, similar like whatever we did for data 1, same thing we do for list as well. So that's how we achieve the data binding in Lightning between the two components. This is very important. So we have seen the theoretical part. How to pass value from parent component to child component and vice versa. We have seen that. Next, we are going to do this so that you can have a better understanding of what we are actually talking about. As I told you before, this concept is very, very important and very, very easy. Okay? Fine. Let's see you in the next lecture. Thank you.